Hello. It's very strange speaking into the ether. As a qualitative researcher, I do like to see the whites of people's eyes, but anyway, I will do my best in the absence of that. What I want to do is fairly broad today, really, and probably unrealistic in the time, but I'll have a bash at covering a number of themes and issues that are particularly interesting to me in relation to qualitative research or qualitative thinking and organizations, and really exploring a qualitative way of understanding the world, saying, well, let's broaden it a bit from research into other things, because we tend to think of qualitative as research, because that's what most of us do, but it's of course much more than that. It's more than just techniques. It can be a way of seeing and understanding the world and looking for patterns and possibilities, how things may change. It's a sort of very organic way of looking at the world, and I think we sort of undersell that to a large extent, and I would like us to try and develop that more in a sense. I should say, to start with, I'm a bit of a mongrel, really. I'm a psychologist by background and have been a qualitative researcher for many decades. And about 10 or 8 years ago, perhaps, I got quite frustrated with this whole sort of battle that there seemed to be, at least in my head, between the way in which we actually worked as qualitative researchers and the structure or the theory of qualitative research, which was much more of a Newtonian approach. And the two never quite came together for me. And that partly triggered me moving on to doing a doctorate in organizational change from a complexity emergency perspective. And that I realized then that actually we could understand qualitative search more easily as a complexity perspective, from a complexity perspective than from a Newtonian one. So I sort of became more and more interested in that, and I'm still becoming more and more interested in it. And I think this has happened from when I was very young and doing psychology, and some of you might remember the Hawthorne experiments, where the experimenters brought more light into the factory, and lo and behold, productivity increased. And they thought, great, more light means greater productivity. And then somebody tried it by having less light there, and lo and behold, there was increased productivity. And so what they realized was that paying attention to people and change in themselves increased productivity. And that very simple thought, I think, is still relevant today, and it's one that we perhaps don't pay enough attention to within organizations. I should say I'm not being at all critical of quant throughout this. It's just an area that don't happen to be particularly interested in. I think quant is equally important within organizations, but I'm focusing on qual today. Hang on, just learning how to go on to chart 2. There we are. So this talk is really a combination of the first the thinking that I was trying to develop in my first book, which is Qualitative Research as Emergent in Inquiry, and that focused very much on the research qual is not just about gathering data and sorting and regurgitating. It's about understanding and connections and looking for patterns, and much more organic. So I'm just finding my, where's it gone? There we are. So that was a sort of looking inwards book. I think this one is attempting to look outwards a bit more. And over the years, we've worked quite a lot in different organisations, large organisations, DWP and the Cabinet Office and Police Service and British Airways, but looking with the employee groups themselves as what's happening and how it can be changed, how they can be more productive. So we've done a lot of work within organizations, and often I've been struck by the way in which organizations have perhaps become more and more mechanistic in their approaches and their processes. This drive towards monitoring, towards control, targets, quantification, in my view, has my experience, has grown a lot over the years. So quantification has sort of dominated to the detriment of qualitative thinking, if you like. And I became interested in why this was, and started to explore it. And why do we adopt targets? Now, there are obvious answers to this. It helps us understand what we're doing, if we're making progress, all the rest of it. But to what extent do we look at how targets work? I mean, a lot of targets are introduced in all sorts of areas, and once the target's been put in, there's a sort of sense, well, as long as it's been met, then that's all right. And I want to explore some of those issues about the unintended consequences of targets. Where's the evidence for targets working? If there isn't the evidence, why do we keep using them? It's almost as if we don't know what else to do. Does it make for happier and healthier organizations? And does that in itself increase productivity? And say, what are the unintended consequences? So all of those issues I became more and more interested in. And I think it's probably worth starting with the very basic, I keep finding my little, where are we? Okay, why do organizations need to be healthier? You can say, well, you know, that's not their role, is it? What's wrong with them as they are? By healthier, I mean more productive, positive, innovative. People enjoy their work. And actually, there are lots and lots of studies that show that productivity is linked to these characteristics. If you have a happier workforce, they tend to be more productive. And that in itself is probably reason enough to be looking at these areas. But nowadays, organizations are usually not set up with the aim of making people happy. They're more likely to be focusing on control. And control is often a way of trying to deal with fear in organizations. We're more likely to be focused on control at the moment because there is a lot of fear in organizations. And I was asked to do a paper recently by the Direct Marketing Association about fear in organizations, and it was a godsend. It was a wonderful paper to do because it allowed me to explore the issues that are in organizations and what is causing this sort of static, fear-ridden culture that we're finding in many places. So if we look at traditional ways of controlling organizations, and this is very simplistic. I mean, obviously, the organizations are complex. But if we look at this as a sort of cliche, in a sense, there have been lots of talk about the balanced scorecard approach to organizations, or the bottom-up approach, or flattening organizations. All sorts of stuff have come and gone over the years. But essentially, we seem to keep coming back to this notion of the hierarchical organization, where we focus on things, hierarchies, targets. We prioritize constancy and linear. It's a very linear, mechanistic approach to organizations. And people often then feel quite powerless in the face of these structures. And it's a sort of really odd, when you think about it, it's a really odd sort of way of viewing the world, because what is an organization? An organization is simply a network of people working together in some sort of way. But somehow we view the organization as something sort of powerful out there that we have to somehow bow down to in a way, which is weird. You know, we get those comments like, you can't beat the system, it's them and us. But we are the system. If you take the people out of an organization, all you get is the buildings. So in a sense, it's a weird view in which we allow our power to be given to this mythical organization. And I'm more interested, I think, in looking at organizations as sort of hives of relationships, of people working together in sort of very fluid, ongoing ways. So I wanted to explore a couple of examples of. I'm still trying to find this little arrow keeps disappearing. Arthur, if you could move me on, I'd appreciate it. Oh, I found it. All right. No. I seem to be stuck on this one. Ah, great, thank you. I've chosen a few examples because I think target culture is a good example of how we can get very rigid about organizations. And I've chosen examples that two of which I've worked on, where targets were sort of corrupted because of the nature of the way in which they were structured. And I've chosen examples over a 25-year period because I'm trying to illustrate the fact that targets have been with us for a very long time. Targets have often failed to achieve what they've set out to achieve for a very long time, and yet we keep going. And this is an example. I think it's so long ago I can use the brand name, which was the RAC. It was the late 80s. And most of the organizations, the vehicle recovery organizations, were introducing these Putting Customers First program. And that meant that they guaranteed that they would get a vehicle to a broken down motorist within an hour, which was great. I mean, obviously, does that make sense? Yes, we all want that. However, the target became the task rather than rescuing the motorist, because it wasn't possible for them to get a rescue vehicle, appropriate rescue vehicle to people within an hour quite often. So if they needed a tow truck, they knew that they couldn't get one within the hour. They knew that they would miss the target. So they were very ingenious about it, the workmen there. So they ordered a motorbike. So the motorbike got there within the hour, but of course couldn't do the task. So the poor hapless motorist had to wait for another hour until the tow truck arrived. So in a sense, the target, with the best of intentions, had been corrupted because it wasn't possible for the people working on the ground to actually deliver that target. So they failed the customer. And I think that illustrates a lot of targets where these are used in relation to situations which can't be controlled. It's one thing having a target where we want to get 5% extra on our sales target. That's fairly simple. But when you're having to rely on lots of different factors which cannot be controlled, those sorts of targets are sort of probably unrealistic in many cases. This is an example that's come back into the news. I got very interested in it in 2010 when it happened, and I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with it. And this was the Mid Staffordshire's NHS Foundation, where there was a situation where at least 400 deaths, and now in fact they're talking about 1,200 deaths, happened as a result of the care at the NHS hospital. And what was happening was that the staff were so preoccupied with meeting their targets, I mean, this is very oversimplified, but that actually they neglected the staff to the point where people were sometimes drinking water from flower vases because they couldn't get any staff attention. And this has come back into the news just in the last day or two, where the NHS chief, Sir David Nicholson, admits that he failed, but won't resign. So that's a big issue at the moment. But what I find really extraordinary is that the managers were so preoccupied with targets and cutting costs that apparently this happened. But how is it possible that an organization that's set up to help sick and dying people should be so fixated on targets that all of these people died of negligence? And to me, that's an extraordinarily difficult question to answer, because I don't believe for a minute that it was deliberate. I don't believe that the employees set out to cause such pain and suffering. But they did it because the mechanization of their job resulted in mechanical behavior. And that was so strong that it overcame a lot of their feelings about patient care and the reasons that they went into the NHS in the first place. So I think targets can be extremely powerful and extremely destructive. They can have their uses, but unless we think through what it is we're trying to achieve, what the possible unintended consequences will be, and unless they are monitored regularly to see in what way are these being corrupted, are they being used in the way they intended or not, then we lose the plot essentially. We did really interesting work with the police force a little while ago in the Midlands, and we were brought in to look at problem solving in the police. This is a more contemporary example, really, showing how this different ways in which targets can help and hinder. So we were asked to look at all sorts of things, but particularly why it was that there were very defined ways in which the police should deal with problems, but in practice they weren't dealing with them. So we had a very interesting time shadowing police officers and going on drug raids and kicking down doors and carrying drug dogs upstairs, that sort of thing. So it was fascinating to be involved in it. But what was particularly interesting for me was how targets had changed the way in which police behaved, and they themselves were very open about it. I mean, surprisingly so. For example, on one drug raid, no, it wasn't a drug raid. It was a domestic. We went along with the police, and it was apparently a minor dispute. And when the police arrived, they were saying, well, you know, what's the problem? And the wife, as it happened, said, well, he's been sort of slapping me about a bit, and but he's not going to do it anymore. And so the police were debating what to do about this, and there were two options, because they could either say, okay, we have a crime, we have a suspect, and we can take him in. If they had done that, then it would mean he would maybe have time off work, he might have a criminal record, it might have other unintended consequences. But if they did that, it meant that they would their crime records would be monitored. It would be there, and it would be clear that they had solved the problem. They knew what the crime was, and they had a victim, and they had the perpetrator. So that would fit with their targets, and they were under pressure to meet their targets. So they had a call between, do I sort of make a judgment here, or do I tick the boxes and meet my targets? And in this case, they decided to tick the boxes. And as they said, this was often the case because their bosses put them under pressure to do so. So there's all sorts of follow-ons from targets. And I think one of the more interesting, I'm clicking away here again. Come on. Yes. They had said for a long time, oh, we don't have drugs in this area. And I said, I've been running around after you, chasing villains with drugs, or not with drugs, who've got drugs over the last few months. Of course you've got a drug problem. And eventually they said, well, we don't have a drug problem, because if we have a drug problem, then we have to have a target. And if we have a target, we need a drug squad, and we don't have a drug squad. So the best thing to do is to say we have no drugs, and then everybody's happy. So it was a very useful way of meeting the targets without solving the problem. So as Springer, who's a management consultant, sums it up, which I think is quite a nice way of summing it up. Many companies are held in an invisible prison. Red tape, rigid administration, procedures, and mushrooming regulation prevent any emergence of dynamism. And if we want a company, and if we want a country and organizations that are lively and innovative and are willing to take risks, then this is not the way to go about it. Oops. So have we moved on? Yes? No? For some reason my little clicker isn't working. So targets, in a way, have become the sort of comfort blanket of the mechanical organisation, that governments and service sectors tend to favour this understanding and rely strongly on targets. Big organisations assume that people need to be controlled, but often this leads to dysfunctional organisations, and often some, as we've seen, some horrendous effects. As I say again, I'm not saying that all targets are bad. For simple goals, when the target offers guidance, when it's regularly reviewed, it's useful. But organizations today are complex, dynamic systems. They have multiple networks. Simple linear targets are often very inappropriate. And so, to a large extent, we seem to have created toxic environments in many organizations, particularly in the public sector, where people are afraid of doing anything or putting their head above the parapet. It's interesting, there was just one of the many, many studies about this. In 2010, Towers Watson Global Workforce Study interviewed 20,000 people, employees, over 22 countries, and concluded that the recession-battered workforce has got high anxiety, desire for security, lack of confidence in management, risk-averse, nervous of innovation or change. Which is a disaster in terms of trying to develop the economy from where we are today. So I suppose go back to why would qualitative skills and thinking help us? I was trying to move on to the next chart there, but yes, thank you. And I sort of tend to see it as we've sort of moved on. From my early days, I remember one of my first jobs was looking for a chocolate manufacturer, looking at whether they should have chocolate Easter eggs as a sort of solid, so that when you got it, you cracked it to open it, or whether it should fall apart into two separate pieces. That might have been the pinnacle of my career, I don't know, but those were the sort of jobs that when I first started in research tended to dominate. And I think up and down a bit, we've sort of moved or broadened what we do with qualitative research, qualitative thinking, into a much broader canvas, in a sense. I mean, at the right-hand side here, if I got this right, no, the left-hand side, they tended to be micro projects. We had a beginning and an end. There was a sort of question and there was an answer. Increasingly, in my view, and you may or may not agree with this, we're moving into qualitative as a way of thinking, as a way of being, that it's becoming part of our social fabric and how we interpret the world. And in changing culture, it's sort of, qualitative thinking seems to me almost essential. I mean, there are some big questions. I'm here again. Questions about it that opens up, really. One is, where does research start and stop? I mean, maybe it doesn't. I mean, if a qualitative mindset is what we are developing, and then we employ this to explore questions, then actually it never stops and starts, in the sense that if you're a doctor, you're never really off duty. And that raises the question of, how do we retain research discipline and rigor if we have these more fluid methodologies? But that's probably a whole new session on its own, really. But given that most new research, or a lot of new research in neuroscience now, is telling us about the role of the unconscious, the importance of intuition, that the rational brain is less important than we give it credit for. Not everything can be measured, and Daniel Kahneman, of course, is the king of all this. So all of those things are coming in and supporting a qualitative way of understanding the world. So if we think about qualitative mind, and Joanna Kronowski has written a lot about this, in fact it's the name of her company, it's a way of saying, this is how we see the world, and this way of seeing can usefully be focused on all sorts of things. Judy Marshall, who's a psychologist, describes it as living life as inquiry, and I really like that, because it's nice and simple, but it also has this sense that the skill is embodied within the researcher, if you like, or the research mentality. And it's a way of interacting, making sense of the world rather than a methodology. So a set of skills, and it's part of us. So if we see it in that way, then we can help define the problem, be a participant, not an observer. Those qualities like curiosity, of being openness, engagement, and being dynamic, accepting that knowledge evolves. So this sort of fluid way of understanding qualitative becomes more important. And of course, being reflective and rigorous about the way in which we think in these ways. So it's a different, I suppose, it's a different way of understanding what it is that we do. I'm speeding up a bit here because I'm realizing I'm rabbiting on too much. And if we look at that sense of qualitative as being a way of understanding the world, and go back to that notion of the hive, that organizations are not just hierarchies, they are also a collection of relationships between people, then a qualitative way of looking at it could be seen as, how do we build relationships with people so that they trust each other and can work together? How can we improvise in situations which are increasingly unpredictable? How do we make connections with people who are in different departments or different functions? The importance of listening and egalitarianism, it is a different sort of perspective than one which is dominated by a sort of quantitative mode. And it's also viewing organizations in a qualitative, organic way. It's in the moment, it's prioritizing change. And unless we have that sort of fluidity in organizations, particularly at a time when we're trying to build the economy, then we get sort of stuck. We get stuck in an age of everybody protecting themselves and not willing to take even sort of limited risks. And that's a sort of quite a frightening sort of a scenario, really. I mean, one of the great advantages of a qual way of thinking is that, come here, I'm chasing this little arrow here, it keeps evading me. I'm sure, oops, no, can we go back one there? Yeah. I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of the elephant and the blind man. It's a sort of old Sufi tale that the blind man came and felt the elephant's ear and said, "Oh, this is a fan," and then somebody else came along and felt the tail and said, "Oh, this is a rope," and somebody felt another bit and said it was whatever. And there's a feeling that we do that a lot in organizations, but we don't connect up the bits. We never really know the whole. And I think a qualitative mindset, by its nature, looks for patterns, looks for connections, rather than for differences or rational lists of things. So they're sort of equally, in a sense, the quantum qual are obviously equally relevant. They're different perspectives on the same thing. It's like a cat who's sort of soft and cuddly, but also has 4 legs. So they're just different perspectives. And I think qual allows us to give that, to get that different perspective that we might not get otherwise in organizations. I was using this as an example of just one particular project that we carried out with the Mental Health Trust, looking at how we could bring in a more qualitative perspective to the work with which they were doing. It was a classic situation in an NHS trust where people were struggling to meet the government targets. They had to meet them, but it took up a huge amount of their time. But actually, their priority was maintaining client care. So they had really 2 jobs as they saw it. They had the meeting all the targets, which took them huge amounts of time, and then they had the patients. So high levels of stress, feeling of being overworked, undervalued, anxious, fearful of increasing workload. So it's a familiar picture. With some other colleagues I was working with who were both in the NHS and were interested in a sort of complexity perspective on organizational change, we set up a year-long leadership program, and this involved all of the senior members of the staff had to take part in it. It was a big commitment for them because it was 2 to 3 days a month. And they also had to had learning sets throughout and do a lot of work. And of course, here were we coming in saying, I know that you've got a lot of client work to do. I know that you've got a lot of target stuff to do. We're asking you to do something else. So there was a bit of a revolt. And the CEO said, sorry, everybody has to come on this. So it really needs senior people to commit to this. So anyway, we went through this process, and it had its ups and downs. But people who, I mean, the main thing I can say, just to sum it up, was at the end of it, people felt that they were able to both do their targets and actually deal with all their client work. Now, why was this? The main reason was because they had developed working groups who could support each other and didn't duplicate work in the way that they've been doing before. So they felt supported, they felt that they had a knowledge bases they could go to, so they were much more efficient in what they would do, and they were also much happier. There's a lot more to say about this, but I'll sort of skip on briefly, quickly rather. I think one of the real tests was that 6 months after the program had finished, the networks were in place, even though there was no formal requirement to continue, which I think to me was said more than any of the research that we did to say how useful was this. And in fact, it's still going on, because I met up at the weekend with some people who've been involved in that, and there are still these learning sets going on, which helps people support people to go through this process. So I would see that as a form of qualitative productivity, if you like. It's been measured not so much by do you feel the questionnaires or even the performance. It's how people felt they were performing and how their colleagues or managers felt that they were performing, and how comfortable they were with the quality of what they were doing. So it's viewing targets in a sense as guidelines rather than goals, where they're reviewed regularly. Are they still appropriate? It's that sense of life is fluid. We have to reflect that in the organisations that we're working with. Okay, I think I'll probably stop there. There's a couple more charts just for. I haven't talked much about. Sorry, can I go back one there? I haven't talked much about theory here because it's not really appropriate in this context. But there are a number of organisational gurus, I suppose, who have developed different sort of ways of thinking about this. I tend to be, as I was saying earlier, a mongrel. I like to sort of pick bits and pieces out of different philosophies or different ways of looking at things. But for me, these particular group of people are interesting if you want to pursue this on an academic level. One is process consulting, which is Skane, who is looking at, if we're going to research, then we need to be there at the beginning, talking to the client about how we define the problem, and not putting ourselves in a position of being knowledgeable, but in a position of being good at asking questions and understanding them, and looking at frameworks which make sense of what we're doing. I think he's very useful, and again, this is another issue really, but he's very interesting, looking at the difference between how he works, which is to start from a position of ignorance, which is fine, and then help the client to develop knowledge, rather than impose it on them or whatever. I think there's a very interesting I don't know, link to this, to how we would cost for work, and if you're having a process consulting approach, you charge from the moment you pick up the phone, but that's a whole other thing. The learning organisation is very interesting to read. Senge or reflective practice, so they're all S's actually, I've just realised, and complex responsive processes. Don't be put off by the name, it's a dreadful name, but all of them are looking at organisations in a much more fluid way and much more relational rather than structures, helping clients to spread learning throughout the organisation. So finally, yes, on a concluding thought there, who better than Einstein? The mere formulation of a problem is far more often essential than its solution, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. To raise questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination and marks real advances in science. And for me, I think this is as qualitative researchers, qualitative thinkers, whatever, keeping this sense of curiosity is key to what we're doing, and I think to do that we have to be brave sometimes, and it's often quite difficult, I think, within organisations at the moment to be brave. And that is the end.